I don't think I've ever enjoyed a symposium more than this one, and I'm overawed to be asked to try to comment on it. I was originally, when I worked out my ideas for what I would say, I was going to try to mention everybody's paper because I thought they were all fantastic. But I realized I can't do it. If I was going to write it up, I would, but in verbal space. I'll mention some of the articles, but what I say refers to all of the articles in different ways. I think John Wiley, his paper about the line, I'd like to kind of do a riff on that. I really enjoy John Wiley's work and find it provoking and so on. So it's just inspired by that in a certain sense. I don't know how many of you know this, but Euclid's Elements, which is about geometry, is probably the most consistent and the most important element in education, at least in the West, since antiquity up until around 1960. This was a major thing. And students sat in class and memorized the formulae that you had to remember, the triangle and all of these things, and then wrote them down in the exams. And I mean wrote not with just W-R-O-T-E, but also R-O-T-E. It was rote learning. And so, I mean, I thought I would just start off with this. So how many of you see what I was talking about? Nobody sees it? Do anybody see it? You see a line. You see a line. How many don't see what I'm talking about? You can't possibly see Euclid's line because you were sleeping in class. You don't know that. You can't possibly see Euclid's line because it's infinitely thin. It was an idea, and this was incredibly important to Euclid and to that time, that these geometric figures were not visible. They were ideas. So you could kind of say with Magritte, who had this famous, also on an easel like this, he had this famous painting, "This is not a pipe." But actually pipes do exist. But if I say this is not a line, it isn't a line. It's a representation of a line. But if you want to really see what a line looks like, there you go. Only you don't see the line, do you? And a lot of people are talking about crossing the line and this kind of line and that kind of line. But I think the line is enormously powerful because when you draw it on a map and you're using the materials, the equipment that you use to make maps and so on, you are using Euclid's geometry to make these lines. And you're making visual representations, but it's not really there. So it's there, but it's not there. And this is very powerful. Powerful enough to be violent. Émile Benveniste, I think that's how you pronounce his name, French semiotician and whatnot, we've heard the expression bioregion as part of the program even, the word region. He looked back into the history of where this word region comes from. And it's the R-E-G in region is related to regent, rule, rex, and so on. And we're talking about Lefebvre and the violence of space and the state and the violence of space, of using space. The thing is that Benveniste says that the state's origins in this kind of mystical priest-king lies in the creation of the region by drawing a line or lines. So this powerful thing creates this region. The king creates it and creates his domination or her domination over what was there previously. The commons that people shared, for example, characteristically in most societies up until enclosure, and most or all land was not property. They had common use rights to it at different levels of authority, but there was not property. Property comes when you start drawing these lines. And so what you get with enclosure, a typical landscape like this, you're looking down from an airplane at the Midwest, for example, of the US. This is what you see. But you see it because it was originally drawn on a map, where they were originally drawing the lines. And when Thomas Jefferson bought the Jefferson Purchase, which was most of the West, the Midwest in any case, of the US, he participated in the creation of the Jefferson-Hartley map, in which they hadn't really surveyed it yet or been there, but they created this pattern, and the states look like this. And I don't have a slide or anything, but if you look at a map of the counties of the US, this whole part of it is divided up into even more smaller and smaller squares. And this, I'll get back to this, but what you get in any case with this is a kind of chessboard space. And so, as you know, in chess or checkers, you can only have one piece on a square at a time. The private owner owns it alone at any one time. And so we have this problem, what we talked about earlier, about immigrants moving into a space and taking it from other people. This happens if you're playing chess. It doesn't happen in a commons, for example, that you share a space much more in a complex way. So that's part of how private property works. Another thing that you could say about this pattern here, they have different colors. I'll make these different colors. What you see here could be described as a net. And in a net, you have knots tying it together, or nodes. And nodality so what you have is locations. And these are points in an abstract framework which you can't see. And you can't see a point either if you weren't sleeping in your Euclid lessons. Now, these points were used by theoreticians like Walter Christaller in his central place theory and others to create a system of a hierarchical system of urban locations that would have a central location that would be bigger and more powerful than smaller ones. And it was decided that a society that was modern and developed would have such a system. And therefore, when we were talking about the African cities developed, actually one of people here is at Lincoln, in Lincoln, Nebraska, which has one of these early buildings of this kind, this huge tower right in the tower building, which when I visited there, someone commented that it was pre-postmodern. But in any case, the point is that this idea of building large towers goes back to these kinds of theories, and there was one of those theories was called growth pole theory, and the idea was that if you didn't have this kind of place, you had to build one. And I think that's, so you see again, this map is behind this thinking that is now growing in Africa, that you need to have this kind of central place. Now, another aspect of this Jeffersonian, for example, principle that Jefferson was also the architect of liberal Jeffersonian democracy. The idea that everybody should have their own little piece of property, and so that if you look at these maps and go way down in scale, you will see that you have the little square with the household, and then you go up and up and up. And of course, one of the very first papers we had by Rachel, was it? Yeah, the very first paper, I guess it was, about this family of farm families and this the struggle for this household. And there were some questions about scale there. But what was shown in Danica's paper was how the Native Americans who didn't have this idea of or the First Nations, as the Canadians call them, they didn't have this private property structure, and therefore people like Theodore Roosevelt wanted to impose it on them. They wanted to impose this structure on them in order to destroy their tribes and their identity. So this structure works in that way. It's very violent in a way. But the idea that you can scale it up was basic to Jefferson's idea. So you have the little family and the little household, and people go broke financing these houses these days. And then you have the bigger section, and then you have the township, and then you have the county, and then you have the state, and then you have the United States, and so on. It's an idea that you can scale up and down. But just like the line doesn't exist, scale does not exist. And we use the term all the time, but it's an illusion. Scale only exists if you have a common denominator that you can scale, like the space of a map, like Euclidean space. You can scale Euclidean space up and down, but you can't scale a family up or down or a person. A little child is not a small-scale adult. So my point then is that if you want to kind of draw the different themes from these papers together, this provides a way of thinking about it. But then we get also what happens when if you have Google Maps, for example, you can look down at a place and then you can tilt it, and then you get what looks like a landscape. And so basically, see, I hate talking in front of landscape architects because I'm such a lousy artist, but anyway.
What is that?
That is a landscape painting. Yeah, here we'll put the landscape in. But the point is, it's the perspectival illusion that draws your eye out into infinity. And so basically what the landscape does, see, if you talk about scale, you have a map at this scale, and at this scale, and at this scale. But of course, you can have an infinite number of maps. You will never actually have the whole smooth space because the maps, the Euclidean lines don't exist. So it's an infinite thing. And so you can never actually figure out in a perfect line anything in laying maps that way. But when you tilt the thing like this, you create the illusion that you can look through scale. And this was really hit home to me when I visited the first in Vicenza, Palladio's famous theater where he created this. He creates a scenic backdrop, which is like a town with the street going down. And the buildings get smaller and smaller as you go back. And so it gives the illusion of scale. But then I asked the guy there, showing people around, well, what happens if someone walks down that street? Won't they get bigger and bigger and bigger? Yes, he said. So what they did was they had midgets or children play the role in the back. So it's a very much like Alice in Wonderland, which builds on the same idea where Alice keeps getting bigger and smaller. And he was a geometer, by the way, Lewis Carroll. So my point then is that when we're talking about landscape in this sense, and about scale in this sense, and about lines, we have to think about this duplicity built into it, the fact that they are powerful because they are an illusion, because they are something that isn't there, but which gives power to people who can make it there and could control over it and turn something that's everybody's into property. So, I've got 3 minutes more. Yeah. I think I'll leave it at that. I'm just trying to give you some way of hanging up the different papers, and as I said, if I wanted to, or if I could, if it was more time and made more sense, I could try to link most of the papers to this, but I think most of them picked up on some elements of this. The commons, which isn't scalar, which is use rights. The commons is, and I should mention that it was asked about tradition. Tradition is modernity's way of treating custom. Custom, in fact, does change, and use rights do change as the things that you're using change. Tradition never changes, and there's this wonderful book by Hobsbawm and Ranger about the invention of tradition. Tradition is fixed and doesn't change, but custom can. And these kinds of common landscapes are capable of change. But these kinds of rigid, oh, and that's another thing I meant to mention. When you talk about rule, the ruler makes this. We also have notions of justice which go with that. So you have, we say that the right, it's a right angle. We say that he went, you ever watch a Western movie? He went straight, He was crooked, but he went straight. A straight line, and a straight, but that can be used in different ways. So it is the notion of justice as something that is justified, like with a ruler or something, is one notion of justice, whereas customary law is another notion of justice, what you have in the way of use rights and so on through time, through change, through use, as a community, which are shared by everyone rather than belonging to individual people. So there's also this notion of justice that we're talking about is very much implicated in this. And of course, a lot of our constitutions are based on the idea of property, which is seen to be the most just. That's what Theodore Roosevelt thought was most just, that the Native Americans didn't have a just system. So therefore, they should be eliminated. Yeah. Maybe I should be too. Well, anyway, it's the conference is now officially.
Points will be had.
Okay, thank you very much.